Imagine being a farmer who has worked the same land for generations, watching your grandfather plant the same fields your children now help harvest, only to discover that when you die, the government wants a slice so large that your family will have to sell the farm just to pay the tax bill. Now imagine that decision is so devastating, so financially ruinous, that elderly and terminally ill farmers are genuinely considering ending their lives before April to spare their family from financial catastrophe. This is not some dystopian fiction. This is Britain right now under Labour's inheritance tax changes, and even Labour's own MPs are horrifying themselves with what they have unleashed. Rachel Reeves dropped this bombshell in the 2024 budget, and the fallout has been so spectacular that tractors have been blocking Westminster, farmers are planning their deaths around tax deadlines, and rural Britain is absolutely erupting with fury at a government they trusted for the first time in generations. Quick favour. If you are gripped by this absolutely mental situation unfolding in the British countryside, hit that subscribe button right now. Over 94% of you have not subscribed yet. It is completely free, takes literally 2 seconds, and helps us keep bringing you these stories that the establishment would rather you did not hear. Cheers if you did. Now back to the chaos. Right. So let us break down exactly what has happened here, because this is a political crisis that has been brewing since the autumn budget and is now reaching an absolute boiling point. Rachel Reeves, in her first budget as Chancellor, decided to make changes to agricultural property relief, which sounds incredibly boring and technical until you realize it is a mechanism that has allowed family farms to pass from generation to generation without being taxed into oblivion. From April onwards, farm landowners will have to pay 20% inheritance tax on their agricultural land if their farms are worth more than £1 million. Now, £1 million sounds like a lot of money if you are thinking about houses in Manchester or cars or yachts, but in farming terms, especially with land values what they are, that is not actually that much at all. Here is the thing that makes this particularly brutal. Farmers are asset-rich but cash-poor. Your typical family farm might be worth several £1,000,000 on paper because land is expensive, but the actual income generated from working that land is often quite modest. Farming is not exactly a get-rich-quick scheme. These are people who work brutal hours in all weather conditions, dealing with unpredictable markets, difficult supermarkets, and the constant stress of making ends meet. When they die and their children inherit the farm, those children now have to somehow find hundreds of thousands of pounds to pay the inheritance tax bill. For most family farms, the only asset they have is the land itself, which means to pay the tax, they have to sell the farm. It is a vicious cycle that ends with the destruction of family farming in Britain. Jenny Riddell Carpenter, the Labour MP for Suffolk Coastal, has become the latest member of her own party to speak out against this absolute disaster of policy, and her warnings are genuinely chilling. At a meeting of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee, she told Farming Minister Dame Angela Eagle that the consequences will be incredibly severe. Not just bad, not just unfortunate, but incredibly severe. This is not the language of someone gently concerned about policy details. This is someone who has looked at what is coming and is genuinely horrified. Her warning about what happens next should make everyone sit up and pay attention, regardless of whether you have ever set foot on a farm in your life. She explained that when family farms are forced to sell because they cannot pay the inheritance tax, they are not being bought by other family farmers who will continue the tradition of careful stewardship and community involvement. They are being bought by massive agricultural businesses, corporate entities, and what are essentially megafarms that operate on completely different principles. That is not going to be good for farming, it is not going to be good for the environment, and it is not good for animal welfare, she said, because standards are generally low on megafarms. Think about what this means in practical terms. Family farms are typically smaller operations where the owners know their animals individually, where there is genuine care and attention paid to animal welfare because these are not just commodities but living creatures that the farmer sees every single day. Mega farms operate on industrial scales where animals are essentially units of production, where efficiency and profit margins matter far more than individual welfare. The environmental impact is similarly concerning. Family farmers have a vested interest in maintaining their land for future generations because their children and grandchildren will work it. Corporate megafarms are answerable to shareholders who want quarterly profits, not sustainable land management for the next century. But Riddell Carpenter did not stop there. She pointed out that megafarms are not good for rural economies either, because they employ fewer people. Family farms are labor-intensive. They employ local workers. They buy supplies from local businesses, and they spend the money in the local economy. A family farm is woven into the fabric of a community in a way that a corporate megafarm simply is not. The money will not be spent in that local economy in the same way as it is via family farms, she warned. This is not just about farming. This is about the complete restructuring of rural Britain, the hollowing out of countryside communities, and the death of a way of life that has sustained these areas for centuries. This intervention from Riddell Carpenter is particularly significant because she is the first Labour MP to win the Suffolk coastal constituency and its predecessors in more than 100 years of Tory control. Let that sink in for a moment. This is a seat that voted Conservative for over a century, and in 2020, they finally trusted Labour enough to give them a chance. And within months, Labour has implemented a policy so damaging to rural communities that even the MP they elected is standing up in Parliament warning about the catastrophic consequences. That is not just bad politics, that is a betrayal of the trust that voters place in you. But if you thought that was as bad as it gets, buckle up, because we need to talk about what happened 24 hours before Riddell Carpenter's intervention. Cat Smith, the Labour MP for Lancaster and Wyre, stood up at the Liaison Committee, a panel of senior parliamentarians who chair various common committees, and dropped an absolute bombshell that should shock anyone with even a shred of human decency. She warned that terminally ill farmers and elderly farmers are considering suicide before April to spare their families from the inheritance tax burden. Let me repeat that because it is so shocking it bears repeating. Farmers with terminal diagnoses are planning when to die based on the tax calendar. Elderly farmers who might have a few years left are considering ending their lives early so that their children can inherit the farm without the tax liability. This is what Rachel Reeves' policy has driven people to contemplate. Not just financial stress, not just worry about the future, but actual suicide timed around tax deadlines. If that does not make you question whether the policy is fundamentally wrong, I do not know what would. Cat Smith explained that rural communities put their trust in Labour for the very first time in a very long time and gave them a mandate for change in this country during the 2024 landslide election. These were communities that had voted Conservative for generations, that were skeptical of Labour, that needed convincing. They took a chance on Keir Starmer's promises, and within months they felt utterly betrayed. Smith said farmers felt misled by the changes announced in Rachel Reeves' first budget, which is quite possibly the understatement of the year. Misled is what you say when someone gives you wrong directions. What has happened here is that rural voters were promised one thing and delivered something completely different that threatens their entire way of life. The changes were announced just months after Labour's landslide victory, which triggered those now famous tractor protests in Westminster. Picture the scene. Farmers driving their tractors, the very vehicles they use to feed the nation, through the streets of London to Parliament, blocking traffic, making noise, demanding to be heard. These are not people who protest lightly. Farmers are generally conservative with a small c. They get on with their work. They do not typically engage in dramatic political theatre. The fact that they were driven to such visible, disruptive protest tells you everything about how desperate and angry they are. Cat Smith laid out the horrifying arithmetic that farmers are now doing. Elderly farmers or farmers with a terminal diagnosis are in a position whereby if they die before April, their farm will pass to the next generation with no tax implications. If they die after April, their family faces a tax bill that could be hundreds of thousands of pounds, potentially forcing the sale of the farm that has been in their family for generations. What would you do in that situation? If you knew you were dying anyway, if you could spare your children and grandchildren from financial ruin by timing your death before a certain date, what choice would you make? It is an impossible, cruel calculation that no human being should ever have to make. The government defense of this policy has been woefully inadequate. They argue that the tax only affects farms worth more than £1 million, as if that makes it acceptable. They suggest that only the wealthiest farmers will be impacted, which demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how farming economics actually work. A farm can be worth several £1 million in land and equipment, while the family running it struggles to make £50,000 a year in actual income. These are not oligarchs hiding wealth in agricultural property. These are working families who happen to own valuable assets that generate modest incomes. Ministers have also suggested that farmers can plan ahead, that they can gift land to their children early or restructure their businesses to minimize tax liability. This advice is insulting on multiple levels. First, It assumes farmers have not already done sensible tax planning, which most of them have with their accountants. Second, it ignores the fact that many elderly farmers are already in their 70s or 80s and do not have 7 years to wait for the gifting exemptions to kick in. Third, and most importantly, it completely misses the point that farming is not just a business that you can easily restructure and reorganize. This is land that families have worked for generations, with complex tenancy arrangements, shared grazing rights, and historical agreements that cannot be casually unpicked. The environmental consequences of this policy are genuinely alarming, and not enough people are talking about this aspect. Britain is facing multiple environmental crises: biodiversity loss, soil degradation, water pollution, and the need to transition to more sustainable farming practices. Family farmers, who have a long-term interest in the health of their land, are much more likely to engage in environmental stewardship than corporate megafarms focused on short-term profits.